empowered people make informed decisions that lead to living a life without regret. This is Sara Khaki and Shawna Woods from Atlanta Divorce Law Group, and this is the Happily Ever After Divorce Podcast. Welcome to the Happily Ever After Divorce Podcast. I'm attorney Sara Khaki with Atlanta Divorce Law Group, and I'm joined by our very own managing partner, Shawna Woods. Today, we are going to discuss couples who remarry each other after getting divorced. Shawna, fortunately or unfortunately, we don't know yet till we talk to you about it. You have witnessed this firsthand with your own parents. So lay it out for us. Tell us a little bit about your parents' history of being married, getting divorced, getting remarried, and just from your perspective, what all that looked like.
Absolutely. So, yeah, that's kind of the running joke is one of the reasons that I think I'm so good at my job is because, I've been dealing with divorce since I was 5, which was the first time my parents got divorced. And thinking back, that would have been, I'm aging myself, I don't care. That would have been like 1977, 1978 when they got divorced. And I remember very much being overly involved in the divorce. Unfortunately, my mom would talk about it pretty much constantly, not necessarily to us, but around us in, being in the car and inquisitive and all of that. So my parents got back together less than a year after they divorced, and then they remained together for about 20 years. And, when I always ask my dad about it, and of course, I got different conversations from both of them, but, my mom was, oh, we were very much in love, and there was mistakes, which she outlined everything that she thought was wrong, and my dad's, version of it is we got back together so I could be with the kids. So it was very much in his mind, and I do think that was true. He wanted to keep the family together. And I think that a lot of people do that. When they go through a divorce or they see really through a separation, do I want to be this distanced from my children? But back then, when a male was getting divorced, his possibility of seeing the children was really limited to basically 2 days a week, 2 days a month, right?
Yeah, I mean, in the 70s, we were still, I think, following the more of the tender age doctrine of younger children should stay with their moms. And, now we're looking more at the best interest. So things have definitely shifted quite a bit. So let's first tackle a little bit of the legal piece of this. What advice would you say you have, if any, general legal advice for a couple who's been divorced and is reconsidering or is considering getting remarried?
Yeah, well, the first thing that I would say, and this is legal because I'm going to say, do you need to get remarried? Is this something that you want to do? And a lot of times, and I've seen this happen, I've had several clients who's gotten remarried after the divorce. The first thing I think you need to take in consideration is, have you processed the emotions that you were having during the divorce? And if you haven't, then I don't know if it makes sense for you to jump back into a remarriage. You were going through the divorce for a reason. Was that reason resolved? Have you both changed and grown? Because if not, you're just going to spend a whole lot of money relitigating all the issues that you had in the first time as far as emotions go. Legally speaking, anything that you had from the divorce that was now separated and yours, that is now yours and it is separate property. So as you're coming back in together and co-mingling, you really need to talk to an attorney about what do you want to keep separate and what do you want to commingle again as a married couple. As far as parenting goes, you come back together and you're remarried. That is an equal, there's no parenting plan, there's no custodial parent, there's the family unit being, reconnected. So legally, what you really have to look at, I think, is a post-nuptial agreement if you have processed all your emotions. But to give a little side story, I remember distinctly after my parents' second divorce, my mom would come over to my dad's house and she would just start taking little things. She goes, "No, no, no, I bought this back in 19 whatever," right? And she would just like hide it and like put it in her purse and walk out with it. And dad would come home and he'd be like, "Where'd that lamp go?" So I think there's this misconception about what belongs to whom after a divorce when you're reconnecting, because I think people can really feel like, oh, this is still my house, right? These are still my things, even though legally they have separated them.
I think from the relationship perspective, personally, I'm such a champion for partnership, such a champion for marriage. So I'm always hoping that when somebody comes to us at first consult, that if there is a hope or a chance for them to reconcile the marriage, make the marriage work, let's first explore that avenue. And for some, maybe the growth or the self awareness, whatever it is they needed, the therapy they needed to go through to reconcile at that point wasn't available to them. Maybe they didn't have the emotional capacity to be available for that, and they didn't discover that in themselves till after the fact, after the divorce, and then had that awakening of, man, I really let something I could have worked on go. I think most people do not take divorce lightly, and they don't reach that decision lightly. But I also think a lot of people get married, taking marriage too lightly, of what immense amount of work it takes to make a marriage really function. So, and sometimes you don't realize it till you're deep, deep in it and you're on the other side of it. So for all of those who, like to your point, are reconnecting and getting remarried from a place of, wow, I've had this great clarity about myself and about you and about all the ways we did it wrong and the ways we could do it better and how I showed up and my patterns and your patterns and the work we didn't put in that we could have put in. That's fantastic. I mean, that's its own happily ever after story, right? And I would love to hear those stories, and I have heard some of those stories, and I love that. And we are always excited when we have a client who's going through the divorce process who reaches out to us and says, "You know what? Can we put everything on pause? We're actually going through therapy, and there's a chance for reconciliation." That's such good news. However, there is definitely the other side. There's polar opposites to everything. And the other side is, how much of this is giving into an old pattern? How much of this is giving into the comfortable? Because the unknown, which is what will my identity be? Who will I be outside of this marriage, outside of this family, outside of being so and so's husband and so's wife? It is becomes so real during the divorce process or after the divorce process that you quickly want to run back to the known. The phrase that the devil that you know is more comfortable than the unknown, right? So I think there's a lot of that people need to bring awareness to when they're considering remarrying somebody that they went through divorce. Is what is the pattern here? What's the story? What am I running back to? Or is this is this going to be a new marriage? And I think that might be the litmus test. Will this be a new marriage, or are we just stepping back into our old shoes? That would be, I think, a wonderful beginning for everybody. And to Shawna's point, legally, the court looks at it as a new marriage as well. So that's how it's going to be treated. What I think is fascinating is your perspective, Shawna, which is the child's perspective, who had that initial conversation or the news of in some shape or form of mom and dad are getting divorced. Had to understand it, had to process it, had to accept it, had to live the new reality of it. And, I think I wasn't a child of divorce, but I grew up with a lot of friends whose parents were divorced. And I watched enough Hollywood movies to develop the belief system that kids of divorced parents are secretly wishing for their parents to get back together. And the movie that goes along with that is The Parent Trap, right? Where the kids get their parents back together to get remarried. How did you experience that? Is that what your experience was, that you were secretly hoping your parents to get back together?
Interesting. Being 5, I don't really have full memory of everything that had gone on or all of my thoughts or even how to process emotions. But looking back on it as a whole and experiencing my parents' relationship after they got divorced and then remarried, E no, it wasn't my experience. You have I love The Parent Trap. It's one of my favorite movies, the original and the remake, and I think it's very sweet, but the idea there was that these 2 people had this amazing love story, and they simply could not even be around each other because their love was just so strong, and they just fought too much. And so, if they could just learn how to love each other and come together, then they would have this perfect family, right? That's the bill of goods we're being sold on this movie, right?
Right.
And we want to buy into it. We
It's
want to
a
buy
second
into
chance
it.
story. Yeah.
Yes. If we get, if the children can just show the parents how to love each other, right? That's the idea of the story. And the reality really is, unfortunately, um, once a child has processed those emotions of, or at least for me, parents should not be together. And then you see your parents reconnecting, it's been odd, to tell you the truth. You've felt certain ways about it. You have your own emotions. And I'm not saying this is for every children or everywhere. And I do definitely think it depends on where you are in your childhood and your development, right? Because the children see the toxicity that leads to the divorce. So when you present it, or if you choose to reconnect, and you're presenting it as, oh great, we're back together, child's mind is immediately going to go, oh great, is toxicity coming back? Not necessarily those words, but is this kind of chaos coming back into my life?
Right.
And I can see that when perhaps the divorce is first happening, and again, children being afraid of the unknown would definitely want, oh gosh, I wish they would not do this. I wish they would get back together. But once you step into that unknown, and I know you and I have talked about that
Mhm.
so many times about being brave enough to step into that unknown, and children step into it too. And once you step into it and you realize, I'm pretty comfortable here, or this is better because I don't have the fights at night or the disruption. I think that, looking back on it, could I say that my parents should have not gotten back together? That's a really hard question because that's forming your life. From a child's perspective, though, I distinctly remember being a teenager, and this was not the second time they divorced, but they were considering it at that point in time again, and actually encouraging them and saying, okay, this is how I want to live and who I want to live with, and this is how we do
Mhm.
what. Right. I think I was maybe 13 or 14, because of the difficulties that they were having, in communication and just creating a life that was not, constant yelling or, fighting, or other people who have, the silent parents. So getting back together for the kids is something I think that you would have to consider, whether or not the children are going to be blooming in the type of atmosphere that you've created. There's going to be some resentment between the parents if they do it for the children, not only towards each other, but towards the children.
Right. Right. I'm dealing with this just to be with you kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, I can only speak from my perspective. And again, that was a long time ago. But I do remember after their second divorce, being adamant. I was adult by that time, being very adamant. You guys need to stay away from each other, not just for yourselves and now your adult child, but my younger brother, was still, he was young. He was 11 when they divorced the second time, and I didn't want to see him go through what I
Yeah.
had gone through, and really. watching my parents just struggle with their relationship with each other. They just were not good together.
Yeah.
And yes, there's an idealistic, do we all want, Betty Crocker or whoever in the kitchen baking and the strong woman coming in and saying, and here's what, we can do. And the guy who's supporting her, we all want this for our children. But if that's not what they're getting, why is it we're going to create a falsity to make the parents feel better about not being separated when the reality is the children will probably bloom better when they are?
Yeah, I remember reading I don't remember the name of the book, but it's a child psychologist that says it's not the divorce that harms the children, it's the conflict that comes out of it that's the most harmful. And I really do think, for the sake of this conversation, it really, what I'm hearing from you and others is the age of the child will really matter of how this will impact them. You know, uh, when you study like children in the law, you go through a lot of child psychology of different age milestones, and why is it that the age of 16 you can get a driver's license, and at the age of 18, well, at the age of 18 voting thing's a political thing, but age of 21 they can drink. But there's these different or 14, some states they can work, and some states that have the right to elect the who they want to live with. There's child psychology that goes behind some of those children in the law rules. And one of the biggest things is that a child, usually in their more formative years, which is under the age of 7, their ego hasn't quite developed yet. So the front temporal lobes, where your consciousness really starts developing, hasn't fully developed. The subconscious is already working in the background, but your conscious ego hasn't quite developed yet. That means is your sense of self is very tied to the nuclear family. So it could be very common that a child at the age of 5 or 6 perhaps would find some comfort in mom and dad getting back together, because their sense of identity is still very formed around that nuclear family, the mom and dad. Their sense of identity is attached to that child, that's my mom, that's my dad. When we go closer past the age of 7 and then into teenhood is when the ego starts forming, and they also are able to process the consequences to actions more, which is what I'm hearing from you, which is, okay, mom and dad, you get back together. What is that going to look like for us in a year from now when you're fighting again? What's that going to look like for where I have to live? What's going to happen to my social life? They're starting to think through the consequences of the actions that could happen. That's why we give teenagers a little bit more rights and responsibilities than we do to a younger child. But the ego is really forming, which is, how will this impact me? It's not just going to be about how will the family feel, how will the home feel, as a smaller child would think, but now you're going to impact my social life. You're going to impact where I live. You're going to impact my household, parts of my freedom. And that it may not be enough for a teenager that, you mom and dad fell back in love or mom and dad figured it out. They've now processed a new ego for themselves, a new identity for themselves, a new reality for themselves, and they're not that easily going to give that up. So it's a very interesting conversation of the age of the child as these things are happening.
Oh, absolutely. And even as an adult, probably, you don't really have quote unquote a dog in the fight when your parents are getting back together as an adult, but it still affects you. It still affects as you were saying, you socially.
Right.
You, I always tell parents when they're divorcing, is like, you're going to co-parent forever. And I don't mean, until they're 18, I mean forever, because there's weddings and there's graduations and there's grandchildren and there's all these things that you're still going to have to process with the other person. So even as adults, seeing someone kind of reunite, um, again, if they've processed all their toxicity through the divorce, or if they've gone on and then reconnected, I think it changes your perspective of what your family is.
Right.
And, to your point, once you have that formed identity and idea of what your family is, it's really hard to go back and accept changes.
Right.
You don't really see your parents as these, well, I guess some people do, but for a long time when you're young, you don't see your parents as fallible individuals, right? They are the world, they are everything, and they are perfect, because that's your whole life. When you're older, you do see the imperfections
Right.
of both your parents, and I do think that it is, more difficult to process a reunification when you've seen the destruction.
I completely agree with that. Well, thank you, Shawna.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Happily Ever After Divorce podcast. If you'd like to learn more, go to atlantadivorcelawgroup.com/resources.